You're listening to episode 121 of the D6 podcast.
I don't know anything more important in our society or in the kingdom of God than to help the church, help the family.
Discipleship is not an event, it's a way of life.
And one day it just hit me that discipleship at home was not about doing more. It was about inviting Christ into what we were already doing.
The goal of family ministry is not families sitting on the couch holding hands and singing Kumbaya. The ultimate goal is families that love God, love people, and make disciples of all peoples.
So that's why you're here. You're here to say 1 hour a week, as significant and as awesome as it is, we know that it's not enough and we want to be intentional with every hour.
You're listening to the D6 podcast. Here's your hosts, Ron Hunter and Jeremy Lee.
This is the family ministry podcast that helps you connect the church and home. And Ron, today we're going to be talking about grandparents with
Who's grandparents?
What? I don't know. Matthew Deprez, I guess, we'll be talking about.
Grandparenting. Okay, I gotcha.
No, yeah. He's going to be talking about grandparenting, and we're going to be learning about the influence. You know, the other day I was taking my son to school, and we actually got on this topic of his grandparents.
Yeah.
And I come from, and I think we discussed a little bit in this interview, of the transformational grandparents who my grandparents they weren't followers of Christ necessarily, and they came from a lot of drama. And actually, it was my parents that made that change and that generational shift. Talking to my son about that was really eye-opening. And there's something about grandparenting that makes just everybody think about legacy, and that's the kind of stuff that...
Well, we're not around our grandparents that often, and we somewhat, depending on the age of the child, we kind of idolize them. I still remember things my grandparents told me, and I remember even my grandfather, all of my grandparents were Christians. They were Christ followers. But I remember my grandfather referring to the Bible quite often. He loved reading the New Testament and Paul's writings. Mm-hmm. And he would talk about Paul. And I heard him talking about Paul in both the positive and the negative in life circumstances. And, that just kind of resonates with me. I can still remember my grandfather beside of his home, outside where we were, just talking and having those conversations.
And there's way more issues in the grandparenting relationship than people realize. I mean, because the relationship a grandparent has with a grandchild is dependent also upon how the adult child and the grandparent,
interact,
I guess that's the father, mother. You know what I'm trying to say.
Yes, I do. I do.
And that can get complicated, which then makes the grandparenting relationship complicated. So therefore, there's a lot of issues to work out.
There are indeed. In fact, you just made me remember a phrase that one of the professors that I remember in school who said, he goes, be aware that the way we treat our parents is the way our kids are going to treat us one day. Mm. I thought how indicting that could be for some people.
Yeah. And so therefore, somebody like Matthew Deprez that is going to come in today and help us kind of navigate this. It has the potential to be priceless. Now, let's don't jump into this without just talking a little bit about why should if I'm a youth minister or a children's minister or a next-gen minister, family pastor, all of those folks that might be listening, if I'm that person, why should I care so much about grandparents? What's the opportunity there?
Yeah, one of the first things that comes to my mind in many smaller churches is that we find a gap in the age group of that probably 30 to 45 in there. And so we find a lot of grandparents who are bringing their small grandchildren to church. So they are the primary spiritual influences in a child's life. And, I've heard so many of our interviews. If you want to go back and check other ones, I'm not sure where your interview is going to go with Matthew on this one, but grandparents seem to want to be the fun person, and they forget how influential they really are. We get limited time with our grandparents. Did you spend a lot of time with your grandparents, or was it like, did you have to make a trip there to go see them for you?
I had to make a trip, yeah.
Yeah. And so that trip was special. You know, it was different. You usually, when you made the trip, you went and moved in. You lived with them for a couple of days, a weekend or a week in the summer or whatever it was. Their environment was different. They might have had a riding lawnmower where we had a push mower. I mean, I remember the fun things with going to my grandparents. You know, my grandfather didn't teach me to shoot, but we would go hunting together. That was a big deal. I don't remember us really ever killing anything, but we went hunting and we had a lot of walks together.
Yeah.
You know?
And so the D6 movement, the conference, and pretty much a lot of the resources you're providing, you guys have committed to educating the church about the opportunity of of influencing grandparents.
That's right. And, you know, I'll say up front, you know, if you have a grandchild that lives some distance away from you and you don't feel like you get a lot of time, one of the easy, inexpensive ways to connect with them spiritually is to buy a D6 devotional study guide, a magazine that's a devotional, one for the age of your grandchild, whatever age, we've got one for them, and one for you. And if you both read that together, you'll have something to talk about because you'll be covering the same content. For the grandparent, it's called Fusion Next. And then depending on the age of the child, it could be, you know, whatever the name is of their age appropriate. And if they're a really small child, preschool, we have a preschool Bible reader. I would suggest you buy 2 copies. You send them one and you keep one, and then when you FaceTime or you talk on the phone, read a chapter together. You know, those are the connections that become super special, and they're easy. They're easy wins for you to make that connection, and it gives you a chance to coach them about life.
And now, before we jump into this interview with Matthew, and thanks so much, Matthew, for being a part. If you're listening now, I want you to hear this, and thank you for this interview that you gave us. But let's just consider this as ministers and leaders and influencers. Let's play it by the percentages. So few parents are actually showing up. How many kids have healthy parents in their lives that are actually there? And if they're there, that they're taking care of them and nurturing them emotionally and physically. And then out of that, let's take the smaller percentage of parents that are going to influence and make an effort spiritually to guide and lead their kids. Now, that percentage is so small. We talk about that all the time. We're working so hard as ministers and churches to build and grow. Now, let's think about the kid who has the parent who is investing in them spiritually, and then, in addition to that, has a grandparent.
Yes.
That is doubling down, and I would say top 2%, 1%. I mean, how many people
I don't know the
have
research,
that?
but we know the stats prove. I was just at a church up in Ohio, and I was speaking to a group of teachers, and 3 of them were in law enforcement. They were in the criminal justice system. 2 of them worked in the jail system for the sheriff's department. 1 was involved. And we were discussing the fact that major research shows that people who are incarcerated have parents who have little involvement in their lives. The absence of a father in many times, or parents who are just not involved in teaching, coaching their kids. We're not even talking Christian. We're just talking
life.
Yes. So you're exactly right, Jeremy. If we could get parents involved, coaching their kids, reading the Bible with them, you know, doing the devotions together, praying together, man, imagine what you're talking about. What could it change?
Yeah.
And we are, by the way, the research is showing that more and more parents and grandparents are getting involved if ministry leaders will show them what to do. They just don't know how to start it. And all we got to do is take some of these ideas off these podcasts that our guests are giving us, bagoodles of ideas, just implement some of them.
Cool. Well, I hope we've got you going a little bit, thinking about this and how grandparents can impact what you're doing in your ministry. And let's keep it going. After the break, we're going to hear from Matthew Deprez. He's going to talk to us more about the influence of grandparents and how they can help just multiply that process of influence and spiritual leadership. We'll see you after the break.
D6 curriculum is centered on the discipleship philosophy found in Deuteronomy 6, that parents and grandparents should be primary in the discipleship of their children. To accomplish this, D6 curriculum aligns every age in church on the same biblical passage or topic. Family alignment serves as a catalyst for parents to have conversations with their children about faith in the home. D6 also provides many other tools to help parents and grandparents. Learn how D6 curriculum can empower parents in your ministry at d6family.com.
I'm excited to introduce to you, probably to our audience, a new face and name. Matthew Deprez is with us, and you are like a beautiful surprise that came to D6.
Yeah.
You're writing a book with Colleen Durr, one of our friends that was here last year.
Yep, absolutely.
She couldn't make it and said, "I'm going to send this amazing dude. Get ready." And here you come, like a hurricane up in here, and just shaking D6 to its roots.
That's right.
Right?
Nothing like being Plan B. I love being a good Plan B right now.
You know, I appreciate the humility there, but I love that you're here.
It's so good to be here.
You're my Plan A for the next 20 minutes.
Fantastic.
And we're going to just knock this out. So if you don't know who Matthew is he holds a master's degree in children, youth, and family ministry. He speaks internationally on issues surrounding family ministry and intergenerational faith formation. Has over 12 years of pastoral ministry experience as an ordained minister in the Wesleyan Church, and is the author of multiple books. Dear Lord, Matthew, I'm out of breath reading your thing here. Matthew lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan. His wife Megan, and you've adopted both of their sons. How cool, man!
From
Welcome.
birth. Yeah,
that's so awesome.
Yeah.
All right, so this is crazy. You mentioned to me you're 35.
I'm 35. Yep.
And so it would be totally natural for your subject of expertise to be grandparent ministry.
Of course. Totally natural.
Go ahead and let us in on that. How
Yeah.
did you get in this idea of studying the influence of grandparents?
Yeah, absolutely. It started out, got really connected with the Fuller Youth Institute. That's who I work for now. So I work full-time for the Fuller Youth Institute and left pastoral church ministry. They did a ton of research on intergenerational ministry. So I got really passionate about intergenerational ministry, intergenerational research, had done a bunch of research myself, and then started realizing there is a huge win to be talked about with intergenerational ministry and intergenerational relationships from a familial perspective. And so for the longest time, for years, I had never really looked at intergenerational ministry from the grandparenting perspective and thought to myself, this is untapped territory in the church. There's just not very many people talking about it. You've got Vern Bankston, who was here. You got Joshua Mulvihill from the Legacy Coalition. But I mean, there's just not a lot out there. And so I started thinking, this is such a natural relationship that exists. And it's really, in a lot of ways, the only natural relationship that exists 2 generations removed from each other. In a lot of ways, intergenerational relationships that are formed can start out to kind of be clunky and awkward and strange, and it takes a long time to build that relationship. Grandparenting just starts from the beginning.
Yeah.
And so you don't have to move through awkwardness to get to a really comfortable relationship with a grandparent and a grandchild often. So that's really where it came from. It started with intergenerational ministry and then really morphed into the familial aspect of things.
I love it. So how can parents utilize sharing their own stories of conversion to help their children grow in their faith?
Yeah. One of the things that we were looking at, and one of the studies that we did with Fuller, was we started asking students how many of their parents shared stories of faith conversion with them. And this isn't by any means scientific, but what we realized is we asked 20 kids in a row that question. And when we're doing breakouts or seminars or when we're doing stuff, we always ask, how many do you think shared their story of faith conversion? So people might say 5, 7. It was 0. 0 out of 20 in a row had shared their story of faith conversion. And that was shocking to us. And I think one of the things that is really helpful when a parent shares their story of faith conversion is that the child who's listening gets to understand, oh, that's my mom and dad's faith. That's not my faith. And so what I think happens when parents aren't necessarily sharing their story of faith conversion is that children have a tendency to live their faith vicariously through their mom and their dad or their pastors or their grandparents or whoever. And they leave high school and they realize, I don't have a faith of my own. I'm living my faith vicariously through someone else, and they have a massive faith crisis. And so when I'm speaking, I will often say this, and inevitably I have a leader in the church come up to me and they say, I just realized, as you said that, I've never shared my story of faith conversion with my kids. I'm going to go home and do that. And when I heard that, actually, my wife and I, our oldest now, who's 6, when I first heard that part of the study, we had our 6-year-old was about 3 months old at the time, and I thought to myself, I've never shared my story of faith conversion with our 3-month-old. I mean, I say that facetiously, but I also said I'm going to live my life always telling my story of faith conversion so that he knows it as he gets older. So literally, it was a Friday. I had the day off. I held our 3-month-old in my arms, and for 2 hours, I told him my story of faith conversion, and he never once told me to be quiet. It was awesome. He fell asleep a couple times, but I want my life to just constantly be about sharing stories, so that as Isaiah and Silas, our kids, grow up, they know, well, that's my mom and dad's faith. That's different than my faith. This is my faith. And they can, Dr. Steve Argue, who's an emerging adulthood expert, would say that self-authorship matters, and you have children who now can author their own story of faith, as opposed to just living out someone else's faith until they have that faith crisis and realize, I don't have faith of my own.
Your latest research focused on studying almost 500 grandchildren, dear goodness, and how their grandparents shaped their faith formation. So what are some of the most common themes that you learned during that study?
Yeah, one of the things, it was interesting. We realized that grandparents seem to shape less spiritual disciplines in their grandchildren and more about their identity and their belonging, their purpose, their feeling that they matter in the world. Like that kind of stuff seems to matter. It seems like parents are shaping more spiritual disciplines. Grandparents seem to shape more the grandchild's identity. So that was really interesting, and I wasn't expecting that. When we went into the study, a couple other things that are really fascinating is grandchildren who consistently witnessed their grandparents read the Bible tended to have upwards of a 30 to 40% higher faith maturity than the average, just by consistently witnessing their grandparents read the Bible. Now, it didn't necessarily cause the grandchild, and at least according to our study, it didn't necessarily cause the grandchild to read the Bible more, but it caused their spiritual maturity to rise in more identity, belonging, purpose issues. So that was a really interesting thing. We also found that if a grandchild consistently watched their grandparents serving on a consistent basis, the likelihood of their spiritual maturity goes way, way high. And so we were really interested in looking originally at whether or not geographic proximity mattered in grandparent-grandchild relationships and how they shape faith formation. And if you look at those two things, Bible reading and serving, there has to be some element of proximity or some element of sharing electronically or something like that. And so those are some of the things that mattered. We found that, interestingly enough, grandparents who went on vacation more than once per year caused a rise in spiritual maturity of grandkids, which is fascinating. So that's really interesting. But also things like eating meals together and having faith-related conversations seem to matter. If a grandparent read the Bible consistently in front of their grandchildren, it tended to create an easier way for grandkids to have faith-related conversations. So stuff like that. If they found that one of the things we found was that if a grandparent served on a consistent basis, faith maturity would rise. But then grandparents actually told their grandkids they loved them more and hugged them more, which was also really interesting. So those are some of the themes that we kind of found. Relationally close grandparents seemed to matter as well. But yeah, a lot of those things also translated into sharing the same faith as their grandparents. So some things didn't necessarily equate to now you share the same faith as your grandparents, but a lot of those things that I was just mentioning, the likelihood of sharing the same faith as your grandparent actually rose if they witnessed those things or experienced some of those things.
Wow. That's a lot of good stuff, man.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
All right, so can you share some practical tips for grandparents to help shape faith in their grandchildren?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we did in our study, especially as we were looking at proximity, as we were looking at whether or not grandparents lived close or far, is we started saying it would be helpful if grandparents had close proximity tips and far away proximity tips. So I grew up in northern Maine, but I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan now. My wife grew up in Buffalo. We don't have selfishly, we don't have grandparents around. So I started thinking, what are helpful tips for my parents and my wife's parents, my in-laws, to be able to do to shape faith formation? So if witnessing a grandparent read the Bible consistently is a way that spiritual maturity rises in kids, then what we recommend is that you actually read your Bible in front of your grandkids and not necessarily in like a prayer closet or by yourself on your personal time alone. And I get it. You want to be focused and stuff, but we want grandkids to be able to see their grandparents actually reading the Bible. And so we were saying, we went away on a vacation, and my in-laws came, and I said to my mother-in-law, Debbie, I said, when you are done reading your Bible, just leave the Bible out on the coffee table and just see what happens. And it sparked conversations with our 6-year-old, which was fascinating.
Wow.
The far away proximity tip that we would say is more and more grandparents are utilizing technology. So maybe you could text a meaningful Bible verse to your grandchild once a week and tell them why it was meaningful. Another way that you can do this, a close and far away proximity tip with serving, is maybe invite your grandchild to serve with you if you live close. That's the close tip. If they live far, maybe if you don't have access to like technology or a smartphone or an iPad or a computer or whatever, maybe snail mail pictures of you serving with a letter that shares the story of what you were doing when you served. Grandparents who shared meals. That was part of some of the themes. So obviously, eat meals together. That's one of the things we would say if you live close. But if you live far, maybe utilizing FaceTime or something while you're eating a meal might be a way that you can actually share a meal together and have conversations. And so often, whether it's my parents or my in-laws, we will actually set up an iPad at dinner time and actually eat with my parents or my in-laws together at the dinner table, so that we can have conversation and it can feel like they're actually sharing a meal with us, even though they're not necessarily in geographic proximity. So those are some of the ways that we would say, if you live close, here's some really helpful tips. If you live far, here are some helpful tips. And so, I could go on and on, but those are a few.
I love this. You've been great. I really appreciate it. So if somebody wants to connect with you online, learn more about your work, how do they do that?
Yeah, you can go to Twitter at Matthew Deprez, MatthewDeprez.
You're on the Twitter.
Yeah, and on Instagram at Matthew Deprez. You can connect with me on Facebook or through the Fuller Youth Institute, fulleryouthinstitute.org, where I work.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here.
Are you looking for the right conference to attend this year? The D6 Conference is a family ministry conference designed for your entire ministry team. Come hear from over 30 speakers and network with churches that share your passion for reaching families. Family ministry isn't just another program. It's one of the most important things your church can do to make a difference in your city. At the D6 Conference, you'll be inspired and equipped to take your family ministry to the next level. To learn more about the D6 Conference, just go to d6conference.com.
Jeremy, I know neither one of us are grandparents, but every time we have a guest like Matthew or Larry or Josh or any one of these to talk, I'm getting ideas. I'm making notes.
Yeah,
I'm looking forward to it. You and I and our listeners have the advantage of being prepared for stages of life we might not yet be at.
I am so with you on that. And for me, I don't know, it just kind of feels like grandparenting is like, that's kind of what you do all this for, so you can get to that stage. It seems like such a fun stage. I know it has its challenges as well, but I'm also excited about next week because we have a really fun guest, Megan Marshman. She's been the MC of D6 Conference. And she's spoken there before. She's a great speaker in her own right, for sure, and author. And she is, if you've never met Megan or heard Megan, the one word I would use to describe her is passion.
Absolutely.
That
oozes passion.
That was the theme that I wanted to discuss with her. And I wanted to talk about, I know a lot of this passion is just natural and God-given, but there's some of us who it doesn't come so naturally. So how can is there a way to kind of fan the flame of a passion for God? So this is really, sometimes we just need to do some soul care on the podcast. And she just basically gets down to that in the interview. So I'm looking forward to next week, and I hope you guys come with a heart ready to just kind of let Megan, minister to that soul care side of where you are as a minister. It'll be fun.
You will not regret listening to Megan and her excitement. So please tune back in next week.
Hope you guys have a great week of ministry, and thank you so much for listening.
You've been been listening to the D6 Podcast. You can learn more about D6 at d6family.com. And if you're a minister, we invite you to join the D6 Leader Network by going to d6leader.net.